All right, welcome everyone to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today, something very special for the channel. I am here with a very special guest. It is Dr. A.P. Canavan, and he is someone whose name you will see if you open up your copy of The Crippled God and by Stephen Erickson, and you look at the acknowledgements page. You will see his name there in the list of acknowledged people. And in fact, you will also see his name in many other books by Stephen Erikson and Ian Esslemont, so many books in the Malazan world. And in fact, among the main series of 10, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I believe your name, AP, appears in both The Crippled God and in Dust of Dreams. Is that correct?
Yep, and I started working as an advanced reader, or working with Steve as an advanced reader for Toll the Hounds.
Toll the Hounds as well.
So, but it was right. Dust of Dreams and The Crippled God were two I definitely did from start to finish.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, among the other books, I believe your name appears in at least I think in a sale. I think I saw your name there in the novels of the Malazan Empire, correct?
Yeah, I've done work with Cam for a number of his novels, and particular for the Path to Ascendancy novels.
Path to Ascendancy,
well.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, in Kellanved's Reach, your name is not in the acknowledgements. It's actually, the book is dedicated to you, which is an incredible honor. That's just fantastic.
It was entirely unexpected, and it was an incredibly nice thing for Cam to have done. I mean, I was really surprised to see it, and it was absolutely wonderful to see that. Seeing your name in the acknowledgements of a book is still special, and then seeing a book dedicated to you, the feeling is just pretty wonderful.
That's an incredible honor. And so obviously you have a lot of experience working as an advanced reader, and we're going to tell everyone what an advanced reader does exactly in a few moments. But working with Erikson and Esslemont, I'm sure has given you some incredible insights into the Malazan world, which is, we are very privileged to be able to hear some of those insights. And because, in fact, the big announcement here is that AP is going to be helping me out with my reread that I've been talking about for months of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. He is going to be, instead of me doing just the regular old review where I talk for 10 or 20 minutes about the book, I'm going to be in a discussion with AP for each of the 10 books. We're going to be doing one a month or so over the next 10 months. So I am so excited for this. This is really the most wonderful thing that has happened on my channel, honestly. So I'm very excited, and it's such an honor and a privilege to have you here, AP.
Well, firstly, let me say thank you so much for inviting me on. I've been watching your videos and your reviews, and I love the channel. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's a great honor actually to be on a channel like this, to have a chance to discuss things with Dr. Philip Chase. Like, let's not hide behind let's not gloss over the credentials here. But one of the big things that I've been so impressed with recently, a number of the YouTubers, a number of the booktubers have been engaging with not just Malazan works, but Malazan works especially.
Yeah.
But engaging with them on a level beyond I like that character, I like this book's great, go out and buy it. People have genuinely been reading the books and doing levels of analysis and discussing them and elevating the language of discussion. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to doing the whole reread with you.
And I am as well. And yes, I totally agree with you. It's really a great time to be on BookTube, and particularly for Malazan fans. It's been real in the last year or so. I think we've seen a lot of great content related to the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the rest of the books in the Malazan world. So one other credential that I want to mention before we get started is that, and this may be one of the most interesting credentials of all, is the fact that AP has inspired one of the characters who appears in the Bocalane and Corbel Broach short story collections. So that's an incredible honor in and of itself as well. I think that's right up there with a dedication, isn't it?
Um, I think if people are familiar with the character and are familiar with what happens to the character, they will recognize this as an honor that is something of a double-edged sword.
Okay, well, we'll have to talk about that one during our discussion for sure. So actually, maybe we could start by discussing, well, what is an advanced reader? I'm sure many viewers are curious about what exactly you do and what are some of the things that you also, it's an important question here, what are some of the things you cannot discuss as an advanced reader? And I think it would be really fun for the viewers as well to perhaps, if they have questions, I'm sure they will, questions for you to leave them in the comment section, and I will be able to read those questions the next time we do a video. In fact, in a week, we're going to be doing our review discussion of the first book in the series, Gardens of the Moon, which I've already started my reread of. So I'm very excited for that. But yeah, so what is an advanced reader? What do you do, and what can you not talk about?
Well, the first thing is there's no set definition for what an advanced reader is or does. It's very dependent on what the author wants you to do. In Brandon Sanderson's recent novel, The Rhythm of War, in his foreword, he lists, I think there are alpha readers, beta readers, gamma readers. Like, he has an entire team who are read certain sections or read the whole book. Usually what happens, as far as I'm aware, is it's an advanced reader is when an author has finished a novel and they want feedback before they perhaps are sending it to the editor or they're sending it to their agent. They want to get good feedback on it to see if there are things they need to shore up, things that they need to polish, or what's working, what's not working. And so it's an advanced reader is not quite an editor. Editors have duty far and away beyond that. But advanced readers typically, at least in my experience, we read the novel, either chapter by chapter as the author is writing it, or we get it as the whole novel, or we get sections of it. And you go through and you pay attention to character development, to world building, to dialogue, to plot points, and you do a line by line read, noting what's working, what's not working, what your thoughts are as you're reading it. Because if you don't like something and you note down in the margin, I'm really bored, where is this going? Then that is feedback that an author can use to look at that section and go, wow, I didn't expect him to be bored there. If you put in the margin, I'm laughing my ass off and I have to put the book down, that is also good feedback.
Yep, sure.
So it's partly recording your reading experience of a novel on a sort of line by line thing, but also picking up on that sort of narratological analysis, going through the standard things about character, plot, world building, action sequences, pacing, connecting themes, underlying themes, subtext, and then discussing things like cliches and tropes, subversions, and just doing that basic level of editorial analysis. So they understand it's not just, I don't like this. That is never good feedback. It doesn't tell an author why you don't like it.
Right.
So that's part and parcel of what an advanced reader does. You then send that back to the author, and the author can read through it. They can take your advice. They can ignore your advice. They can read through the comments. They do with it what they want, because this is their book. I, as an advanced reader, have no ownership whatsoever on what any of the authors do. I can give my 2 cents. I can express opinions, but ultimately the book is a piece of art, a piece of literature created by this author. Right. And I'm giving them feedback that they can use if they so choose, to to make small changes, to make big changes. It's entirely up to them. So one of the major drawbacks, particularly because I've done so much work for Erikson and Esslemont, or Stephen Cam, which I will constantly slip into calling them.
Of course.
One of the major drawbacks is quite often I get the novel significantly before publication.
Uh-huh.
And often then I'm already reading the next novel, the next project, or something else before publication. And so when it comes out and everyone gets all excited about discussing it, I'm already a year and a half down the road to the next novel.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine, if without going into spoilers of the particular series, but let's imagine you were an advanced reader for The Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
And Tolkien gave you the Fellowship of the Ring. So you've read through that, you've given him notes, you've given him feedback, and you're like, great, when's this coming out? And he goes, well, next year or the year after. You're like, okay. So then he starts sending you sections of the Two Towers. And by the time the Fellowship of the Ring comes out, and all the fans and all the internet boards, because we're pretending this isn't today's day and age, are going, oh, what do you think's going to happen? You cannot, under any circumstance, join in those discussions because you're already three-quarters of the way through the Two Towers.
Right, right.
You know what's going to happen.
Right.
And it's a massive betrayal of trust. It's a massive betrayal of confidence. Even if you think, oh, well, I'll just drop a wee hint, you know, you can't do that. You cannot discuss the author's work. And then related to the first point that I made, that this is their work. No author in the world wants you discussing, oh, well, I suggested he make that change. You're like, I don't get ownership of any of it. This is their work. It's their writing, their ideas. They put it together. So if I ever said, oh, well, I had suggested that so-and-so do X and they did it and the book's better because of it.
Right.
That's me making a claim on someone else's work. So the rules basically I have about advanced reading is I never, ever discuss what I actually say to the authors, what I comment on. And this isn't just Stephen Erikson and Ian C. Esslemont. This is other authors that I've worked with.
Right.
I don't ever reveal what I discuss with them or what notes that I've given them. It goes against everything that you actually do.
Right.
Does that kind of explain it?
Absolutely, yes. So you would never be able to talk about their current projects or anything of that nature. You would never be able to talk about specific feedback you gave, which ended up in the book and that sort of thing. So everyone knows not to ask questions of that nature.
Well, people could ask that question and they'll get the following response, which is, yeah, I mean, I was really blown away by parts and sections of the book and character development. And yeah, it was awesome, but I can't talk about it. And I'm not going to give you any specifics.
So it was cool, but I can't say what it was. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. So, but privately though, you do get to at least smile to yourself when you're reading the book as it's published and say, aha, he ignored me here, or oh, he actually took my advice. So that's kind of cool too.
And that is sometimes you make a point to an author and they do it and you go, oh wow, I feel so proud. I helped them improve that bit of their book.
Yeah.
And then you log into an internet forum and someone goes, see when he did that? That was awful. Why did he ever do it? And I'm sitting there going, I'm now responsible. I'm now responsible for a negative comment on the book. It's my fault.
Oh no. Well, I'm sure that never happens. So anyway, obviously though, you have earned the trust of the authors that you work with, all of them, not just Erikson and Esslemont, all of them. And that's a pretty big responsibility, really. And I think it's just fantastic, and it's an endorsement of you and your literary insights that they have come back to you time after time to say, hey, can you read this for me? And what do you think? You know? So how did actually did you meet these guys? How did you get started as an advanced reader for them? And maybe while we're talking about that, you could tell us about how you inspired Erickson to write that character.
Well, that's all wrapped up in a very similar story. Back when I was a grad student, and I had just finished my master's in science fiction literature and science fiction narrative, and I had begun my PhD in genre fantasy literature. I had written a conference paper on Neil Gaiman and Charles Vess's A Midsummer Night's Dream from the Sandman.
Nice.
Discussing specifically the fact that the visual narrative was distinct and separate to the written narrative. So Vess had created a separate story within the comic book, and Gaiman had written a different story. And then by combining the two of them, you got a third story. So, and one of the scholars that I knew said, Charles Vess is going to be a guest at the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts in Florida this year in March. You should come along and give your paper. So I thought about it, you know, went around panhandling for change as grad students do, ate ramen for 2 months.
I know how that is. Yeah.
Just save up the money. And I went to Florida. And because it was a transatlantic flight, I'd flown in a little bit early. And this bumped into the Celsium scholar who said, I'm going out for lunch with Stephen Donaldson and Stephen Erickson, and would you like to come along? Now,
wow.
At this point, it is important to remember, I hadn't read the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I didn't know who Stephen Erickson was.
Oh, okay.
But I did know who Stephen Donaldson was.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So in that conversation where they said, we're going out for lunch with Stephen Donaldson, Stephen Erickson, a couple of the other authors, all I heard was Stephen Donaldson. Because I had that moment of going weak at the knees and going, seriously, Stephen Donaldson is here. Like the Thomas Covenant Stephen Donaldson, like not some other random person called Stephen Donaldson.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was all excited about this. And we went out to lunch, and I was sitting at lunch with Stephen Donaldson and Stephen Erickson. And I got chatting to Steve Erickson about his work.
Huh.
Now, this is an embarrassing reveal. I'd never seen a picture of Stephen Donaldson, and I'd never seen a picture of Stephen Erickson.
Uh-oh.
And they were both just introduced as Stephen.
Oh, no.
So I was talking to Stephen Erickson, thinking he was Stephen Donaldson.
Oh my goodness, how long did that last? I mean, at one point, did you say, well, I really love Lord Fowl's Bane? And did he say, oh, me too? Because I think he does say Donaldson is a kind of an important influence for him, right?
Yeah, and Donaldson, fantastic. I mean, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, one of the most important series in genre fantasy. Right up there with Tolkien, right up there with a lot of the other texts that you've been going through in your channel.
Yep.
But it dawned on me partway through the meal when someone had turned to the gentleman on my left and went, Donaldson. And I just went,
oh.
Now, luckily, a lot of the commentary I've been making to Erickson were things like, you know, the complete difference in tone and how it's so different from a lot of other genre fantasy.
It's applicable.
The way that, the way that it's slightly darker, the way that you're delving into the psychology of the characters.
Oh. And then you left at dinner and said, I have to read this really fast.
So I had gotten away with it. And, you know, went back. And then as the conference went on, I kept bumping into Steve Erickson, and he was such a nice guy.
Yeah.
So he was so approachable, and he was coming because I was presenting. He came along to hear my paper. We chatted about it in the break between sessions. I went to a lot of the fantasy sessions as well, So, and he was sitting in on a lot of those because he was interested in what the scholars were saying about fantasy literature.
Yes.
One of the things about Steve is that he is fascinated by and engages in a discussion with scholars, with fans, everyone. Like he really loves the intellectual pursuit, like in this way.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That week we kept bumping into each other, ended up having sitting at lunch and at dinner together, and he was extraordinarily generous with his time. And I had to confess to him at the end of the week, admittedly it took me to the end of the week, that I hadn't read his books, that I had thought he was Stephen Donaldson when I was first speaking to him, and I had to beg his forgiveness.
Oh wow!
Now, by this Steve kind of, in that very gentle Canadian way of his, with his very dry sense of humor, forgave me.
Oh.
But he went in and he happened to have with him a couple of copies of his first Bockling and Corbel Brooch novellas. So he gave me, straight out as a gift, gave me these things.
Wow.
And I was like, I'm gonna have to read them. So that was how I met him. And then because we kept going to the same conference and meeting up every year, and then exchanging emails just about various things in fantasy, because we kept meeting up every year, we developed a friendship, and it has been a roller coaster of a ride, getting to see and experience some of the things that Steve sees and does.
Oh, that's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that. And at some point, I assume he must have introduced you to Ian Esslemont as well.
Yeah, and that was great, because Steve every year tries to encourage, well, obviously, unfortunately, this year because of the pandemic, it was curtailed. But he tries to encourage various other authors he meets on book tours or at conventions. He says, you have to come to this. This is amazing. You have a captive audience of people who are genuinely interested in your book, not because it's some sort of marketing exercise, not because they just want your signature, but they actually love the literature.
Yes.
Come to this conference. It's mind-blowing. So we managed to get Cam to come down from Alaska.
Wow.
Which I assume involved huskies and sleds and that sort of thing.
But only in the winter.
Cam,
yeah.
So Cam came down, and it was again, absolute pleasure and a blast to meet him, because I'd been getting all of the stories from Steve about Cam. And we were sitting down, and it was then, so Cam, tell us some stories about Steve. And you just see Steve went, it was a mistake to bring him here.
Because they were roommates in their grad school days, is that right?
They were on digs together. So out when they were doing archaeological digs, and then they were roommates, housemates. I don't know the North American nomenclature for it. But I think they shared a house while they were both doing an undergrad. Because I always have this thing in American movies, they go, your roommate, and I'm assuming it's like 2 beds in 1 room, and you go, that's just weird.
Yeah.
Do you not get your own room?
But yeah, I'm sure they had some great stories. I know from my grad school days, those are some special bonds, you know. So yeah, that's fantastic that you've had a front row seat to some of the stories between those guys. That's just wonderful. So how I guess we could move on as well, since we're talking about grad school. I'd love to hear, and I'm sure the viewers would be very curious, because I've had a lot of viewers ask about the relationship between fantasy and academia. And that's probably because I am an English professor and I am into fantasy. So a lot of people assume that academia is hostile to genre fiction. And so what's your take on that? And I think most importantly, tell us a little bit about your scholarship, about your dissertation, your work on fantasy, which I personally think is very interesting.
Well, there are a lot of academic programs where you can study fantasy literature without it appearing to be studying fantasy literature.
Right.
There are ways and means to do it for anyone who is interested. But one of the important things is genre literature, including fantasy, is gaining more and more scholarly interest because it is so highly influential. And this is no longer the 1930s and the 1940s of the pulps sending out any old story. We now have a highly professional, highly well-developed, intellectual, intelligent, booming industry of fantastic authors and writers.
Yep.
Where we seem to have gone from a time period where there were bright luminaries like Tolkien, like Donaldson, like Gene Wolfe, like even going back, depending on how you like them, Robert E. Howard, the problematic nature of H.P. Lovecraft. But these were literary minds that helped shape writing, had an immeasurable impact on writing.
Yep.
And now when we look at the quality of fantasy literature coming out, the diversity of fantasy literature coming out, it's not just popular, it's also great literature. And more institutions now are recognizing that, particularly for PhDs, a lot of the skill and a lot of what you're being tested on is your ability to analyze, your ability to research, your ability to put together cogent arguments.
Yes.
And you can test that regardless of the subject matter. But universities, some of which are, let's say, more focused on attracting popular courses to raise more revenue, have realized that putting courses on that are about popular media forms and popular texts and narratives and popular series is a way to get undergraduates invested, is a way to get them to retain them. It's a way to get them to experience university and to learn doing something and reading something that they like. Just because it wasn't written 200 years ago doesn't mean that it's worthless.
That's right.
And of course, like you've seen very similar arguments where people go, "Oh, why fantasy?" And you go, "Oh, yes, because Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is what type of literature?
Yeah.
Bram Stoker's Dracula. That was pulpish vampire fiction, but that is now a classic, particularly reading it from an Anglo-Irish perspective. I mean, it's a fascinating look into colonialism and representation of sexuality in the Victorian era.
Yep.
You want to go further back? Let's have a look at Beowulf, one of the ones that you definitely know.
Yes.
And you go, yes, because that was definitely a diary. You know, fantasy has been part and parcel of our culture, of almost every culture on the planet from the very beginning. As soon as we had the ability to talk, we had the ability to make up stories.
Yeah.
And fantasy has been part of that storytelling tradition. And so I think, yes, there will always be resistance in certain circles to something that they dismiss because they do not know.
Yeah.
In the same way that science fiction was often dismissed, but some of the great works, people go, "Oh, 1984 by George Orwell," or you want to look at Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. These books are now recognized as literature, and you go, "Yes, science fiction literature."
Yep.
So I think that attitude is changing, but slowly.
I agree. Yeah. And I've often thought that rather than being called Homo sapiens sapiens, we should be called the storytelling animal. And it's absolutely just an essential part of the core of really what we are. And it's just I completely agree with everything you just said. It's I think necessary for us to function properly, and it is certainly worthy of academic study. So yeah, amen to all that. And let's see, what about your own dissertation? Would you mind saying a word or two about what you were looking at?
I'm trying to think of how to put it in a way that will not bore the socks off everyone listening. The easiest way to describe it is there was a perception, certainly when I was researching and writing, that the key foundational text to understand fantasy literature, the genre of fantasy, what we would commonly call genre fantasy. The key foundational text was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And it began and ended with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
That's the received wisdom. Yes. Yeah.
And I am a huge fan of Tolkien. I first read it, I was about like a 10, 11, 12. And then I used to read it. I used to read Lord of the Rings every year. It was a thing I did coming up to Christmas. I would reread the Lord of the Rings. I love the Lord of the Rings. But during the rest of the year, I was reading a lot of other fantasy, and I went, the Lord of the Rings doesn't explain this. And I wanted to prove that there was another type of narrative that was actually more influential in terms of the narrative structures, tropes, and even the shape of narrative within fantasy. And that was role-playing games.
D&D and all that.
D&D, and then all of the computer games that D&D inspired, the role-playing computer games. Then also all of the franchise novels for Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Ravenloft, and all of the books that they inspired.
Yeah.
Because for every classic fantasy novel published, there was usually about 5 or 6 franchise novels published. And you go, they wouldn't keep publishing them if they're not selling.
Right.
So our perception as academics, when we were looking at what we called fantasy, was slightly skewed because we were overly privileging certain texts and ignoring a lot of everything else. So when we created rules about this is what fantasy does, or when we were trying to describe what fantasy does, it never worked because we were ignoring a massive subset of fantasy. So the easiest way to explain this, if you imagine a wizard, 2 warriors, and an archer, and they come up, and the way ahead of them is blocked by a demon, a big monster. Traditionally, in sort of D&D based stuff, what we would expect to see happening now in the book, if this encounter happened, is the 2 warriors would run in to engage the monster. The archer would be plinking away with the arrows in the background to distract the monster and help out. And the wizard would be gearing up to fire off a massive fireball or a lightning spell to blow the monster to pieces. But the warriors are there to protect the rest of the group and to engage the monster. The long range person is there to do a bit of damage, but more distract them to prevent them from harming the front row guys. And all of this gives time for your damage dealer, your DPS in the wizard to blow up the monster. And you go, if that happened in a fantasy novel now, you go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's logical. And you go, that's D&D. Because that is essentially what happens in The Lord of the Rings, except when they see the Balrog on the bridge, Gandalf says to the warriors and the ranger, you guys lead the 4 hobbits away, and I'm going to take out my sword and hit him on the head. And this is not the perception that we have of what wizards do, of what warriors do. And you go, well, if that's not the perception, where is that coming from? And it's coming from D&D, and it's coming from these role-playing games that are based on that. You have a clearly defined role. That role has a function. That function has an associated physiology, and that physiology then ties back into role.
Wonderful. My socks are still on, I think. Yeah. And I think this is very applicable to all the books in the Malazan world, which are famously based on the role-playing activities that Stephen Erikson and Ian Esslemont engaged in as grad students. I think you can correct me if that's wrong, but they're Exhibit A, aren't they?
Well, Erikson and Esslemont took D&D rules, created a homebrew campaign, created their own world. In fact, it's one of the strengths, I think, of the Malazan world that got created is the fact that you had 2 highly imaginative authors working in cooperation and developing it over time, because they were out on archaeological digs in a tent in the middle of nowhere. They were poor students who were sitting eating ramen noodles and going, what are we going to do tonight? We can't afford electricity. Let's game. But when Erickson would invent something, then Cam would help develop it. when Cam invented something, Erikson would help develop it. And so what you had was any of the weaknesses or biases or oversights that one had, the other helped correct. And it then made this Malazan world so seamless, well developed, but also it's not just breadth, it's depth and consistency, authenticity, and verisimilitude. It's an amazing accomplishment. But we have other authors who did this, like Raymond E. Feist's Magician, and that whole of the Rift War cycle and the Rift War saga. That was based on his D&D homebrew campaign that he did with his friends, and he acknowledges that in his books. And then he co-wrote the Empire trilogy with Johnny Wirtz, another brilliant fantasy author. And that was based in one of the other worlds that one of the other gamers had created as a sort of bolt-on companion campaign. We have a lot of authors now who have come up, even if they did not specifically play D&D, played computer games. They played Skyrim. They played Fallout. They played Baldur's Gate. Even the big launch of Cyberpunk 2077 that came out very, very recently. That entire thing based on a role-playing game, and everyone is talking about story development. Within it.
That's fantastic. Thank you for describing that. And it doesn't sound boring at all to me. Not at all. In fact, quite interesting. So let's move on. I think we were going to do something fun here. Actually, everything has been fun so far, but we're going to actually do recently, actually my last video was the Malazan Reader Tag, which was a created tag by one of the new, we just mentioned before, how great these days are for people who love the Malazan Book of the Fallen on YouTube. One of the new kind of Malazan related content creators there is Counselor of Moonspawn, and she created this fantastic tag with some questions that I myself did recently. And I'm going to be asking AP, I'm going to be asking you the questions from the tag. I feel like it's a great way for the readers to get to know you a bit, if you don't mind. And it'll be kind of fun at the same time. So, and also while I'm talking about Counselor of Moonspawn, and she's one of many new Malazan themed channels. There's Ruth and Bad, and there's Good and Kind. I actually have a list here I wrote. There was Raft Blue Taxed and Graceless Passion. A lot of these people have been inspired by the work done by Iskar Jarak, who has been a real boon, I have to say, to all the Malazan fans. He's the one that I think that got it really started on BookTube. But there are some others as well, who do Malazan related content. It's great. Andy Smith, Kate Kennedy, Books with Brittany. There's Alan from the Library of Alexandria. There's Books Rebound. There's Matt there. And I think a really big, exciting thing that's happening in the future too is Mike's Book Reviews is going to be doing the Malazan Read Along next year. And he's got a great channel. And there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of excitement about this read along, which is happening. So it's a great time to be a Malazan fan on BookTube. That's for sure. So anyway, let's do this tag. Are you ready?
Okay, hit me with the tag.
All right, here we go. Question number 1. How did you find out about Malazan?
At university, when I was doing my first degree, a very good friend of mine who'd recommended a lot of fantasy books said to me, AP, you have to read Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson. And within half an hour, I'd immediately forgotten about it and didn't do anything with it. And then I told you that very embarrassing story about meeting Steve. And he gave me the Balklane and Corbel Broach books. And I sat down and I read them. And I went, why was he talking about epic fantasy? This isn't epic fantasy. And then I took a trip to the bookstore. And I bought a copy of Gardens of the Moon. And that was how I discovered Malazan.
Okay.
Stephen Erickson gave me 3 books because I was an idiot. And then I went to the bookstore to get the first book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
We all have our own path, so that's yours is one of the best stories I've ever heard, honestly. So how about number 2 then? Describe your experience reading it for the first time.
To be perfectly honest, I opened up Gardens of the Moon. Now, remember, this is in the middle of me doing a PhD on fantasy literature. I
Yeah.
had to read roughly 450 fantasy novels. So my reading time was a little precious, because I was working with a lot of novels that I knew about. So this was a completely unknown, and I didn't know whether or not it was going to fit.
Huh.
So I opened it, and I read probably about the first 50 pages and went, I don't have time for this. And I put it down.
Uh-huh.
By the way, Steve doesn't know this. Well, okay, so Steve's going to know this now.
He's gonna know. If he watches this, he's gonna know.
Um, and then once I'd finished off a section of research, and I went, oh, I'll pick this back up again. And I started reading it again, and I went, I'm a bit burnt out. This is complex, and I
Yeah.
don't have the mental focus for this. What
Yeah.
I need is something that I can just easily read as a bit of relaxation. So I put it down again, and I was doing more research. And then I'd come home for the holidays, and I went, you know what? I'm home. I have time. I actually have time booked off my PhD, and I brought it with me. And I sat down and I was reading it, and I just was going. I was trying to figure it all out in the way that so many of us do.
Yeah.
But particularly because of the nature of my PhD, I was trying to figure out everything and growing very frustrated that I didn't know. And I just had a moment where I went, you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm just going to read it,
Yeah.
and I'll just see where it goes.
Yeah.
Because we all know when you finish something, you think back on it and you go, that's what all that meant. I went, okay. And at that moment, I just became absolutely hooked on the Malazan series.
Yeah.
You know, as I said, for my PhD, I had to read 450 fantasy novels.
Wow.
And I'm not bragging about that number. What I'm trying to get across is when I say that the Malazan world, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that the characters created by Stephen Erikson and Untitled Esslemont are amongst my favorite, best, most well developed, and they are deserving of being at the very top of what we recognize as the masters of fantasy.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it just because I go, oh yeah, I thought the books were good. I studied this stuff and was blown away by it.
Yes.
Really impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Fantastic. So it sounds like you answered this question in a way, but maybe you would like to elaborate on it. When did you realize this series was going to be an all-time favorite? It's number 3.
Probably when I finished Gardens of the Moon.
Uh-huh.
And thought about what had happened in it. There's a spoiler from very, very early on in Gardens of the Moon, and we can save this for when we discuss Gardens of the Moon if you'd prefer.
Sure.
But there's one moment very early on that, looking at now, I go, that is the signal to me that this series, this author, this world is worth reading.
We
so
definitely have to talk about that. Yeah, we have to talk about that. Yeah. All right. Nice. For me, I think it took me until the second book to realize just how brilliant this was. It was Deadhouse Gates for me, where I thought, wow, okay, this is different from anything. So yeah, but I do love Gardens of the Moon too, so I can't wait to talk about it. So, all right, let's move on then. What is your favorite aspect of the series?
Are we talking specifically about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or about the wider, because including Cam's books as well? Because it's very hard for me to say, you know, the series. The series is the entire world that both of them built.
Let's go with that.
You don't have
yeah.
one without the other.
Let's go with the broader interpretation. I like that.
That they've created one of the only fantasy worlds that I can actually believe existed. So many fantasy worlds, you go, that's a really cool idea, or that's awesome, or you get this idea in your head and you picture it and you go, this is so amazing. How vivid. How did they ever come up with this? This is one of the few that isn't based in our world. It isn't just urban fantasy using our world with fantastic elements. It isn't a secondary world where you go, yeah, but their economy doesn't work. Or, you know, it feels like a reality. It feels real. And that's due to the attention to detail and the care. I don't think I've ever come across that in another book that is developed as well and is so powerful. Cam's is it Blood and Bone when they're in the jungle, and the feeling of that jungle narrative. That's not a spoiler, it's a picture on the front.
Yeah.
But the jungle itself is a character in it. The number of times you read Tarzan and you go, oh yeah, it says jungle, and you read jungle. In Cam's book, you actually feel the jungle, you smell the jungle, you can almost taste the jungle. When Steve is writing about one of the desert scenes, it feels arid.
Huh.
You know,
And these guys lived in places like, I mean, they're basing this on their own experience, real experience. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but Esslemont worked in Southeast Asia for a time and probably encountered actual jungles and so forth. So yeah, that's fantastic.
And obviously they're both Canadians, and we all know that Canada is very famous for its jungle and its desert.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So bring your shorts when you go to Canada. Yes. So, let's see. What else do we have here? Okay, number 5. Nothing is truly perfect. Share a little gripe you have with Malazan.
I will tell you one thing that I have told Steve to his face maybe a couple of times. There was one tick of his writing in his early books that used to drive me batty. And that was being obtuse for the sake of being obtuse. The number of sections that start with 2 characters in dialogue, and it is only at the end of the section where you get the character name. And once you pick up on this, I get to the end of the section, I go, right. And then I had to go back to the start of the section to now read it in the character voices.
Yeah.
Because, and in Steve's defense, their voices are quite distinct. That is not one of the things that I'm particularly good at, is giving like different accents to characters in my head. That's not how my reading brain works. So I was reading it and going, I don't know who these people are. And then finding out who they are and then having to reread it. That was my gripe with a lot of the early books.
Well, you know who else does that? Hemingway does that a lot. So he's in good company there, right?
Yeah, and that's probably who Steve stole it from.
Maybe. We'll have to ask him next time you talk to him. So, all right. Well, let's see. What else do we have here? So, this is a good one. What are your favorite and least favorite installments? And again, if you want to interpret that broadly, you can. Or if you want to just stick to the 10 books of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, you can do that as well. I'll leave that up to you.
For the Malazan Book of the Fallen, weirdly enough, Gardens of the Moon is one of my favorite books. It's a controversial choice for a lot of people. We can discuss this more, I think, when we talk about the book, about why I am so impressed with Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
It is a first novel in the series, so there are issues with it. I acknowledge that, but it's still what Steve is doing with it is really, really impressive. But my favorite book, probably in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, is Toll the Hounds. At the time when it came out, there were a lot of the fans hated it.
I've heard that. I've heard that.
This was something that used to happen quite a lot, actually, with Steve and Cam's books, that they would get released and the fans have been looking forward to them. The fans would read them. They'd post on message boards about how much they hated them. And then 6 months later, 6 months later, they'd be posting going, this book is amazing. And you go, by any chance, could you go back to your original post in that thread and say, I've changed my mind?
Yeah.
That I read through it too quickly, didn't pay any attention, and I didn't like it. But now, having thought about it and reread it, I go, this book is amazing.
Yep.
That's been my experience with a lot of these things.
Yeah.
But sorry, what was the question?
Oh, it was your favorite and least favorite installments.
Oh yeah, so it was and Toll the Hounds in particular was one that a lot of people complained about. That then months later we're going, this is brilliant. I loved it. It was the first one that I advance read for Steve as well.
Yeah.
So it does have a very special place.
That's a nice personal connection. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
But the emotion running through that book, the emotional current in it, was just so impressive. And I just thought it was an excellent book. Of Cam's, weirdly enough, one of Cam's books that I absolutely adore is Dancer's Lament.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And one of the reasons for this is there's a certain style to a lot of the Malazan writing, both Cam and Steve, in that they have multiple points of view and they're moving across a history where you're getting these insights into different pieces and actions happening, and you're piecing together a narrative from that.
Right.
But Dancer's Lament, Cam did something just completely different.
Yeah.
And went, no, I'm cutting down on the points of view. I'm focusing on one very small region, and we're going to follow through on one main thread. And it was such a change that it showed that with the Malazan world, you're not limited to only one style. Like Steve's Buckley and a Corbel Brooch books show that you can do horror, you can do parody in the world as well. Or you can do Chaucer in Crackpot Trail. So that's I would have to say Gardens of the Moon, Toll the Hounds, Dancer's Lament, and then Crackpot Trail because I'm in it.
Yeah, I love Dancer's Lament too. I read that fairly recently and reviewed it, and I noticed exactly what you're talking about. It's a more compact story. Most of it takes place in Liheng, and it's just a really nice personal kind of story that I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So, and the whole series really, Path to Ascendancy is. I've recently finished reading it, and I've been mooning about it quite a bit. So.
But what's lovely about that series is, and it's one of the things that both Steve and Cam do throughout all of their other novels, is everyone tells these stories about, oh, this was the old guard, or this, and everyone's aware of this history to where these people come from. And now we've gotten to see it, and you go, it's a bunch of lies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know that some people were disappointed, and you go, but think of who these characters are.
Yeah.
Of course it's a bunch of lies.
Yeah.
It is, I just think some of the moments in it are hilarious, where you suddenly see where something that 50 years from that book has achieved such importance and it's sacred to talk about, and you go, no, that's how it happened. Oh God.
Yeah.
And you just start laughing.
And it's interesting because you see this point made all over the place in Path to Ascendancy. You see it made in the Carcanis trilogy with Rise Herat, the historian. There are quite a few historians who appear in these books, and they inevitably have a very, let's say, jaded view of history and what history does. And I think it's a pretty interesting thread that you could find in the books.
It's almost as if both authors were archaeologists and anthropologists, and they thought putting those characters in those jobs might be a little too on the nose, so they made them historians.
Yep. So I love it. Okay, so let's see. How many times, number 7, how many times have you read the series? And everyone assumes you've read it 1,000,000 times.
And this is a weird one. I have read each book in the series all the way through once. Just once.
Really?
I have read sections of each book 50 to 60 times.
Yeah.
I have read parts of Gardens of the Moon over 100 times.
Okay.
I have skipped through the series backwards and forwards. I have read, obviously, because of what Cam and Steve have allowed me access to, I've seen early drafts of things. I've seen early notes of things. But to sit down and read once, and even then, I haven't read Dust of Dreams, The Crippled God, or any books that Steve has written after that in published form, because
Uh-huh.
I I I was sent them all. I read those versions, and even with Dancer's Lament, when I was looking, I went, obviously you can see it on the shelf. I got the physical copy, but I skimmed through it to see if certain things, or how Cam had resolved certain issues. And I was like, this is amazing. But I didn't read it then. I'd already read it.
Yeah. Huh. That's
So it's very, very strange. People assume that I have read the series over and over again. And there are fans out there who, if I'm stuck trying to go, because it's a lot to keep in your head. And you go, I wonder who is that character? I know I've seen that name before. There are fans out there who could tell you that character's star sign, where
yeah.
they used to go to school,
Yeah.
what their favorite weapon is, whether or not they sleep on their left. There are
Their
fans
social
out there who
security number.
know these.
Yeah.
They know these works inside out.
Yeah.
Um, the the difference to what I do with it is, when you're reading through it to edit it or to advance read it, you're reading through with a fine tooth comb on chapters once, twice, three, four times, um, and sending notes back. And you then don't feel like reading it again as soon as it's published, because you're doing that for the next book. So I'm actually really looking forward to the reread,
Yeah.
because for me, it will be the first time rereading the whole series.
So it'll be your first reread too. in a way. Yeah. So that's awesome. Then I'm delighted then, because I feel even more honored to have you participating in this. So yeah. Well, how about this then?
I,
Besides the Malazan Book of the Fall, and this you could probably answer in one word, I think, but here it is. What other series from the Malazan world have you read?
well, I've read all of them.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in fact, I was actually thinking, the only uh, book of Steve's that I didn't advance read for since Told the Hounds was the Balklean and Corbel Brooch book he did live on Facebook, where he was writing a page a day and putting it up on Facebook.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved in that, so clearly, that's why the others are superior.
Of course.
No, but so I've read everything that Steve has done since then, and I think I've read the majority of what Cam has done since then as well,
Yeah.
and other projects that are knocking around. So yeah, I've read it all.
Yep. Amazing. Yeah. So okay, well, let's move on then. But number 9. What are your? This is an interesting one. I think I'd love to hear the answer to this. What are your reading interests beyond Malazan?
Um, to be honest, anything in what in my PhD I call genre fantasy. I love fantasy. I love reading all types of fantasy. Recently, because of my job and various other things, I hadn't been doing a lot of fantasy reading, and then because of pandemic and I was on furlough,
Hmm.
I went, I haven't read all of Brandon Sanderson yet.
Hmm.
So I got all of Brandon Sanderson and read it. And that's been really interesting. I then realized I'd skipped one. I skipped Dawn Shard.
Oh, I skipped it too. Yeah.
I didn't realize that came before Rhythm of War.
Yep.
And I'm
Yep.
like, well, I'm now going to have to go and get that. But I obviously, because a lot of my friends are involved in fantasy scholarship, and I have a lot of friends who are authors who go, oh, you have to read this. You get these recommendations. My to be read pile um, could safely hold up a dining table, but as soon as I get a chance to sit down and read, you're just transported to another world. So I will read anything in fantasy. My favorite is epic fantasy. If you have to pick a sort of subgenre of it, my favorite would be epic fantasy.
Yep.
But that's what I read. There's a lot of science fiction then that people go, oh, this won this award and this won that award. You should read that. That gets thrown in there as well.
Yeah.
I used to read a lot of legal thrillers, and then realized that they're all basically the same, so I didn't want to read those anymore.
Huh.
I never read horror.
Huh.
I don't read horror. No.
I don't either. Yeah, I have not ventured much at all into horror, except for maybe the classics, you know. But I'm not a horror kind of guy, I guess. Yeah.
And the thing is, it's one of my friend, great author, author and poet called Brian Dietrich, is a massive horror fan, and he keeps saying to me like, "Why don't you read horror?" And I go, "Brian, I can't get into it. It is not that horror is badly written. It's not that horror isn't good. There are amazing books out there that I know that the writing is powerful, that
Yeah.
the structures and everything going on. It's just not my flavor of book. In
Yeah.
much the same way that, there are certain food substances that I do not like.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
are other food substances that I love. It's more to do with the I just never got into horror. My one of my brothers loved horror, tried some of them, and I was like, this isn't for me.
Yeah. So horror is your broccoli.
I like broccoli.
Okay. Okay.
Horror is my fish.
Okay, fish. Okay. Very good. No seafood for this guy. All right. So let's see. I think we are on the last question of the tag, which is a lot of people would love to hear you answer this one. What advice would you give to a first-time reader of the Malazan Book of the Fallen?
The advice I would give is just relax from the very beginning. When you open the first page, just relax, read it, and experience it. Don't try to understand everything.
Yeah.
In a lot of modern writing, particularly in the genre, we have grown very, very used to having direct information, or information fed to us directly through info dumps, through very blatant direct exposition, to people telling us that this character is angry. He said angrily. We,
Yeah.
we we have gotten very, very used to that, and part of it is we are a TV and movie culture. We are used to getting all of this information visually. We're not used to piecing it together
Yeah.
from literature. It's a change in our culture and our reading. But something like Malazan is written exactly the way that all great literature is written. It's not written just as a story that you just follow along and it's done and dusted in some sort of disposable fashion. It is written as literature, it's written as something to experience and to savor. So if you think about the Malazan Book of the Fallen as an attempt to write 10 novels that describe the whole of World War II, where book one is the Eastern Front, book two is set in the Africa campaign, book three deals with the politics in America as they're trying to decide whether or not they enter the war, and then suddenly the conflict that develops in the Pacific. Book five goes back to the Eastern Front. Book six, we're now in Western Europe, in France, with the conflict. That's how you think about it. If someone wrote that story and you didn't understand World War II, you'd be going, who are these people? Why is this going on?
Yeah.
You wouldn't understand it. But because we have the context of World War II, someone could write those books and we'd be, oh yeah, that's fine. Oh, these are brand new characters. Oh, well, that's absolutely fine, because of course they're in a different part of the world. But when it comes to fantasy, if you look at the number of comments from people who say, yes, but I liked that character, why are they not in this book?
Yeah.
Or why is this not a storyline about these four characters going on these adventures? We're so used to linear storytelling now that any attempt to show the story of the world, which is full of really interesting characters and stories. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not that Malazan doesn't have a story, but it's telling it in a very different way. So my advice is just relax. You're not going to understand World War II until you've read everything and had time to experience it and sink it in, and then go back through again and realize that it is actually all connected.
That's beautiful. I love that analogy, and I had not heard that before. The World War II analogy for the Malazan Book of the Fallen. That's brilliant, actually. I love that. So, well, thank you so much for doing the tag. That was a lot of fun for me, and I'm sure the viewers are going to enjoy your answers too. And also getting to know you a bit. And I think we've got a lot to look forward to in the coming months with our Malazan reread for the both of us.
Yep.
And I am so excited to be doing this with you, AP, and Gardens of the Moon in 1 week. So I already started. I'm actually just finished with Pale. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a mess there right now. But
I hope they come out of it okay.
yeah, we'll see. So depends on who they are. But yeah, so thank you so much for being here today. This has been just a delight.
And thank you again for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and I really am looking forward to doing the reread.
All right, fantastic.